Okay. Thank you for selecting this paper. This is joint work with Claudia Steinwender from Munich and Shumin Qiu, who's now at the East China University of Science and Technology in Shanghai. So I think it has probably escaped no one in this room that the contribution of Chinese scientists to this global scientific enterprise has been increasing markedly. And we can do that using any number of metrics. Here is China's share of world publications, but we could look also at China's share of received citations or the number of Chinese highly cited researchers. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I think that's been kind of really well documented, right? So Chinese scholars contributed a lot of papers, but one question you might kind of think about is whether they are really contributing to pushing the scientific frontier out, right? And one thing we know is that just because you produce knowledge doesn't necessarily guarantee that others are going to be able to build on it. It's going to be, that effect is going to be filtered through any number of institutions. And so we want to ask, how fertile is China's research, right? Certainly the increased number of citations and highly cited researchers is suggestive of great fertility, but are these citations from researchers that are themselves engaged in frontier investigations, right? And so here's what we are going to do. We're going to compare two very similar papers from the labs of different elite PIs. So think about two papers that are published in the same year, in the same journal, that have the same quality, in quotes. Just suspend disbelief that I can actually do this for a few minutes. And then you can come down on me. But not in the same narrow subfield, so that they're not actually competing for citations, right? And the only thing that's going to change is the nationality of the last author. Okay? So one is going to be a Chinese scholar, and the other one is going to be from another country, not the US. So think about Germany, or Korea, or Japan. And what we're going to ask is whether Chinese papers attract more or less citations from a frontier country, which we're going to take to be as the US. Okay? So why are we picking on the US? Actually, we can repeat the exercise for other large countries, but the US is undoubtedly a frontier country in chemistry, which is the field we're going to study, and it's also large in size, so we're going to be able to slice and dice the citation data in many, many ways. Okay? So what do we find? What we find is that Chinese papers suffer from a sizable citation discount, right? They receive roughly 30% less citations from US researchers. And in some sense, we try our darndest to make this discount go away, and we can't really succeed in making it go away. It seems it's very stubborn, and it seems very stable over time. It's also uniquely Chinese, okay? And I'll show you in what sense that is true later on. And so we're running through kind of a number of explanations that could explain this. Maybe those Chinese articles are in some unobserved way of lower kind of fertility potential. We think it's not the case, but that's the one thing we can't completely rule out given our research design. Maybe it's not about quality, it's about perceived quality. Now we have a proxy for perceived quality that has to do with the number of retractions in a paper's narrow subfield. That doesn't seem to help us much elucidate this puzzle. You might think that this kind of depressed level of citation might reflect some sort of animus towards Chinese scientists. But what we're able to show is that it's actually not present for Chinese PIs living in other countries. Okay? So it's specifically directed, if its animus is specifically directed at Chinese scientists in mainland China. And in the end, the explanation or the class of explanation that seems to have the most purchase is kind of shallower networks of Chinese scientists in the US relative to scientists in other countries. Okay? And we have a variety of proxies that can kind of like help us pinpoint or lend credence to that class of explanation. Okay, so that's the outline of the talk. And looking at the time, I'm not at all sure I'm going to be able to go through it all, but I have ways of cutting my losses when it's needed. Okay, so we focus on chemistry. So it's not a completely random choice. First, China has a great and storied history of contributions to the field of chemistry that goes back, many, many centuries. But by the 19th century, Chinese research in chemistry as well as other fields had fallen behind. But when things got kind of a little bit rekindled in the second half of the 20th century, starting maybe in the 70s, chemistry was one of the leading fields, right? So if you think about in which fields are Chinese chemists, are Chinese researchers leading relatively more, chemistry is certainly one of the three that you would mention, along with material science and computer science. Okay, I'm going to skip this. So we begin by doing something very, very rough. Okay, we're basically looking at all papers in chemistry for all countries outside of the US. And we're looking at the number of citations that those papers attract from US papers, right? And a US paper is a paper that only has US addresses, right? And you can see, and we can kind of control for journal fixed effects, time fixed effects. So the raw data basically tells us that there's a discount, okay? But of course, there's a lot here in this aggregate analysis that we can't hold constant, and we certainly can't understand what's going on. So we want to do more than this. Okay. So what is the data going to be? It's going to be a sample of basically elite chemists. Okay. So who are the elite chemists? So we have a very clear definition. It's the people who write the largest number of papers that appear in a set of around 30 chemistry journals between 2000 and 2018. Okay? So those are the most published chemists for almost 20 years, right? And we're taking the top 1% of the sample, and once we eliminate all the US PIs, we're left with 750 scientists, okay? Okay, and then we stalk those individuals online. We ask them for their CV. We collect all the information that we can from the people who don't give us their CV. And we're basically able to recreate their careers from the moment of graduate school to the present time. Okay? And then we are very, very kind of detail-oriented when it comes to capturing their publications and just their publications, which for a large number of Japanese and Chinese and Korean scientists, not always fun, but we really try to do it, and the fact that they are chemists and we have their CVs helps us in this regard. Okay? All right. And then, okay, so then what we're going to do is that for each paper by a Chinese scientist, we're going to find a twin paper by a non-Chinese, non-US scientist. Okay? So paper is going to be in the same journal, same publication year, roughly same number of authors, roughly same age for the PI, and then the quality of the paper, okay? So I'm going to tell you what our measure of quality is, but it demands some unpacking, and I will do that in a minute, okay? So the indicator of quality is the number of home debiased citations from the world, excluding the US, okay? So what does that mean, okay? So if you think about the citations that a paper is receiving, right, you can decompose it on the number of citations that it gets from home, from researchers in the same country, plus citations that it receives from the US, plus citations that it gets from the rest of the world. Okay? Now, the citations from the US, that's going to be our outcome variable. So let's take it out. Okay? So we're left with the citations from home and the citations from the rest of the world. Okay? The problem is that citations typically exhibit a lot of home bias. And in fact, my team of collaborators and I have a paper on this that just showed up in the NBER working paper series on Monday. Okay? And that's true for all countries, including the US, but it so turns out that China has the highest degree of home bias by far, okay? By very, very far. And so what we want to do in some sense is, get to this citation measures, excluding the US, but kind of like handicapping the number of citations that you receive from home by a factor that reflects how home biased your country is, okay? So it's going to be more of a handicap for Chinese scientists than it would be for Swiss scientists, for example, okay? And so that's what this slide basically explains, okay? All right, so now we're gonna have, right, so we have those pairs of papers. We have those paper twins. Those are the papers that are cited, right? And now we want to think about the papers that are at risk of citing this paper. And this is where I start thinking about what would Zvi think of this? In a sense that, you know, like I think you put a lot of effort in going from the industry level to the firm level, right? So really, microeconometrics was the name of the game. But now we're going to the article level or the citation level or the project level. What would he say? Would he be impressed by all our new toys? Or would he start saying, you know, you're slicing the lemon really thin? And I think in this paper, I'm like slicing the lemon extremely thin because we're going to think about individual citation pairs, right? We want to bring to bear a citation risk set for each paper. And so what's a paper at risk of citing one of our cited paper? It's a paper that is topically related to the paper that is sourced in the sense of an algorithm that Kyle knows really well called PMRA, which basically links papers on the basis of shared keywords, the mesh keywords that Danielle was talking about this morning, title words and abstract words, okay? That algorithm, importantly, has nothing to do with collaboration patterns or citation patterns. It's only about language, okay? For each of our cited paper, each of our paper has roughly 11.7 articles in its risk set, right? So this is how it looks like. Here's a paper by a Chinese scientist in our data, and you see on the right, those are the papers in the risk set, okay? So there are papers that are outside the risk set, right? So that could be, they could be papers that cite the paper, but they're not topically related. We take them out. Or they could be papers that are not topically related and also do not cite, okay? All right, and now we're in business. Now we're running a very simple series of linear probability models, which we're going to saturate with fixed effects, and the coefficients of interest are kind of a China indicator variable, and then as well as a China indicator variable interacted by stuff that have to do with characteristics of the papers or the investigator, right? We control for lots of things. You can see it here on the slide. I'm not going to kind of describe everything, but there are a lot of fixed effects in those specifications. Okay, so here's what here's kind of basically the simplest specification that we can report, and this is where we get to this discount for Chinese investigators that is in magnitude equal to roughly roughly 30%, right, of the average number of citations. So that's pretty large, right? And so we're thinking about ways in which we could make that citation discount disappear. So here you might think of kind of a number of things like communication patterns. Maybe there are language barriers, networks. Maybe Chinese researchers are less likely to have a network with US researchers to disseminate their work or to be invited to conferences or to be able to go on to conferences. Maybe intellectual research clusters in certain subfields in particular countries, and maybe Chinese researchers cluster in subfields that are not very active in the US, okay? Maybe Chinese research may be of quality that is perceived as being lower, even though it might not be lower in reality. And our approach here is to develop a series of proxies for those things, okay, that you can judge as being more or less convincing, right? And then both entering them directly into the regression, but also more interestingly, I think, interacting them with the China indicator variable, okay? To try to think about where this citation discount comes from, okay? Before we do that, a really important thing to show is that this discount is really very China-specific, right? So in some sense, our choice of making China kind of a pivot, right, and then putting everyone else as a control group, that's a completely arbitrary choice, right? What if we made Switzerland or Germany the pivotal country? Or what if we invented a new country composed of all Chinese researchers outside of China, okay? And in this set, we have included Chinese researchers who work, say, in Sweden or Germany, as well as researchers from Taiwan and Hong Kong, okay? And we've invented a new country for them. And as you can see, if we make them pivotal, right, their research is not discounted by US researchers. If anything, there's a little bit of a positive, imprecisely estimated premium, right? To me, that's the key piece of evidence that kind of argues against the discount that we find reflecting kind of animus towards Chinese researchers, okay? It's also been quite stable over time, okay? There's no clear pattern here when we do this year by year. Okay, so I want to give you a flavor. I want to avoid going through tens of regression tables. So I want to give you a sense of the proxies that we have developed, and then I'm going to show you a few of the results that I think are the most intriguing. Okay, in particular, the thing that I think we've been able to do is to think about those scientists who did some or all of their education in the US. Okay? Because we might think that those scientists have deeper networks, right, than in the US than those who have not, right? So, and we're able to measure that quite precisely. And what we can show is that having done one's PhD or one's postdoc in the US diminishes the magnitude of this discount, but doesn't make it completely go away. It roughly halves in magnitude, okay? Another result that is worth mentioning is that, we were trying to think about how to get at this perceived quality. Right? You may know that there have been a lot of cases of scientific misconduct that have involved Chinese researchers, cases of retractions, cases of citation rings, and we were trying to think about, could we capture something systematic about this, right? And so to do so, because we have a subfield for each paper in our sample, we can think about how retraction heavy or how misconduct heavy, really, because we're also thinking about errata, I think, right? The plural. Okay. How retraction heavy is a subfield, right? And we can kind of measure that, and we have quite a bit of variation on that, right? Now, it's only one measure, and we did not find in our data that explained much of that discount at all. What we can find, though, is that, as I said, Chinese investigators with US training suffer much less from this discount than others. Okay? I'm going to kind of skip this. I'm going to skip this. I'm going to skip this. This is the retraction result. Another dimension of heterogeneity that we look at is whether, in some sense, this discount affects papers regardless of where they appear in the journal pecking order. And roughly, it does. Okay? There's no great heterogeneity there. Okay, so let me conclude, because I think I'm almost out of time. So we've had this rapid rise of China in research and science over the last two decades. And so we ask whether China's research is as fertile as that of other countries. And we find that no, right? We find that there's a relative underciting of Chinese science by US scientists, holding quality constant, you know, with the caveat that, okay, we're doing this as best as we can, but of course, you know, our measure is not perfect. I should say that, you know, one thing I haven't said is that we try to do this in numerous different ways in the paper, and it doesn't really change the nature of the conclusion, right? And in the end, the explanation that seems to us to be the most reflected in the pattern of results that we can show is that there's probably reduced awareness of Chinese researchers' contributions because they have shallower networks in the US relative to Germans and Japanese and French researchers. Okay, let me end here.
Thank you.
Thanks for the chance to discuss this paper. I will make my call to Zvi here with what Pierre mentioned about what would Zvi think, but also back to what I mentioned earlier, that when I was reading on his reflections about also training graduate students to kind of get very micro and measurement, Pierre was one of my advisors, and my first paper after my PhD was doing analysis matching at the paper level and looking at citations of Soviet-era articles. So I have to say, it's nice to see the training here that I can now discuss a paper of yours. Okay, so, as Pierre said, I think we all know really well that...
Is it loud enough?
Yeah, okay,
No
I can have more volume. So China has really become the top producer of scientific papers in many fields. And so what Pierre and his co-authors are trying to do is to really, look at, again, like is it fertile ground, as he said? Is the research really being utilized to advance the knowledge frontier in other countries? One thing that we'll come back to in my comments, we also know there's increased geopolitical tensions between U.S. and China, and it's really changed the nature of collaborations and other things, and so that's kind of going on in the background. And so what Pierre and his co-authors are asking is, it's very clear, are Chinese scientific papers cited as much as a similar paper by U.S. Researchers, or I like how they phrase it, a China citation discount. So Pierre, was very clear. I won't really, I don't need to go through all of this, but I do want to stress that they're really looking at the elite chemist, right? So with the idea of who's really doing the frontier research, and so then, if we look at the U.S., if they're not citing those researchers, then it means that there's something going on. They're going to, for each author, link to the number of last author publications. They make, some interesting choices that they explain very well in the paper why they do this, because they really want it to be, kind of publications that are of the PI, independent. And then a key thing too that he mentioned, again, there's good reasons that they do this, but they're going to look at citations by papers where all authors have a U.S. affiliation. So you want to think about this as a particular subset of papers with U.S. authors where everyone on the team has a U.S. affiliation. Okay, they do this article level matching where they're going to find, one control paper co-authored by a non-Chinese for kind of their treated, which is by a Chinese, these elite Chinese scientists. And again, as Pierre said, they control for, paper level measures of quality and then a whole bunch of other things that they're going to put into the regressions. And yeah, this really, cool approach of kind of, identifying which papers are at risk of citing these papers. And, they have these really, cool data set of these twins, right, of papers that they match. Okay, and so, as he said, so, first what I like is they just show in the aggregate data, what do you see, like what's kind of the correlation, and so they find this number, right, of 48%, Chinese papers get 48 fewer U.S. sites compared to articles from other non-U.S. countries. And then once they put in, some controls, right, just for year and journal fixed effects, it goes down to 24%. For the matched paper sample, again, they find a significant China discount. And again, this is controlling, as he said, about quality. And I'm not going to dig into that. I'll let other people about whether that's really controlling really well for quality. But I'll get into kind of some other things about citations and as a measure. They basically can't get it to go away, right? And so, those of us labor economists, right? Kind of this unexplained part of it. What is going on? Can we call it something like discrimination or something else? They don't, get into that, but they do examine various channels. Okay, so so this is a really important paper on an important question. This is Pierre and his co-authors, right? So it's really carefully done, rich data set. The appendix is beautiful. So this kind of what says about our field, that this part about chemistry in China, that was an appendix, but very beautifully written. So hopefully that will be appearing in another paper, I hope. I will say that I think many of us were in this summer institute session last summer where Philippe presented, I think, right, and Lee gave this great discussion where he kind of really was like, we need to study, Chinese science and U.S.-China, relations and how that impacts science. So it's cool to see, papers that are in this area and kind of the growth in these. And so there's been a few recent papers that, I think there's one very recently that I think has very consistent results with what Pierre is showing, which is by Carolyn Fry and Megan McGarvey, where they show that following COVID, when you had a bunch of articles coming out, they saw that preprints that had authors from Chinese institutions got less attention. This is with downloads and other things, and they kind of, similarly control for quality and topics. So I think that's kind of consistent. They have kind of a behavioral explanation for why it is that when you have a lot of information, you're going to kind of rely on, let's say, biases of where people are located. The other thing that I think this paper points to that's nice is, I see that Chesco's in the audience. So, mobility of scientists, that play, he has great work on this, and, that is really a channel through which then we can see that is playing a role in kind of reducing this difference. Okay, so, just a few comments. I think we're in that point of the afternoon where it's like we're, lunch, or we're getting a little tired, so I'm going to throw in something a little fun in a second, maybe. So why is there still such a large unexplained citation discount? So, and I felt like, they do a bunch of things to try to rule out different things, and again, find that, training in the U.S. is probably the important one to reduce it. But there is still something there, and so what is that? What do we call it? Again, like labor economists might call it, discrimination or bias. There is, I was thinking, this related research on the gender citation gap, which has a similar empirical approach, right? So you have a, gap in citations for women and men, and then you kind of throw in all these things you can observe, and you're still left with something. And so here it's kind of, they call it this Chinese, discount effect, but it's like a gap. Okay, so the first comment is, we know that U.S. researchers are citing Chinese research less, but do we think that they still might be using it to advance their research? And so, I know that, this is a big topic, and the authors discuss this about, thinking about, this is, a big topic, right, of do citations actually reflect knowledge flows? Even beyond strategic citing, citation choices can reflect politics, right? Power, norms, status, etc. There's a great, piece by Kareem and co-authors that try to look at some of this. And, the authors do say, and I hear the nice graphic where he shows that, sites that are included for status or these other effects, they're kind of addressed through this, the citation risk set approach. So basically, he had it in the lower part where they're not part of the risk set, so if they are citing the article, they don't account for it. But I wanted to push a little bit about what about sites that don't appear for the same reason? So maybe the Chinese researchers are reading the articles, but they have no incentive, or they're not. The norm is to not cite them. Could that be happening? And so this is maybe, it's fun for me, I don't know if fun for you, but I got to bring in some Soviet-era cross-border knowledge flows. So we know that from the Soviet period, there was actually a lot of access to knowledge. This was kind of a fun Russian-English vocabulary with grammatical sketch to be used in reading mathematical papers. I don't know how much Russian was in those papers, But, you know, one thing that you saw is that, you know, there was awareness, and that was actually, you know, Borjas and Doran and others show that, you know, it still wasn't totally, you know, free flow, but the fact that you still had access, but I don't think they were really citing them. And so I think there is, you know, kind of these other settings where you can see that they're, you know, it impacted the science, but you don't see the citations. I thought this is one graph that I have of U.S. citations to Soviet papers published from 80 to 90. And so you can see this is, there's still some citations early on. They kind of pick up quite a bit. So again, there were these barriers. Actually, the mechanism is similar of like people migrating to the U.S. So I think we can see that it's consistent even with this period. Which leads me to the second question, you know, comment, which, yeah, I was maybe a little surprised that there was kind of not much mention about U.S.-China relations, and I know that wasn't the focus, and you're looking over a, you know, a longer period. But, you know, there's a lot of literature showing that, you know, from other settings, so USSR, World War I, Fabian Baldinger and co-authors, they show that, you know, knowledge diffusion is impacted by geopolitical tensions and conflict. I'm doing some analysis now of Ukraine and kind of the separation of Ukraine and Russian science, and you see it there as well, that citations to Russian science by Ukrainians really drops after 2014. And so, you know, there's recent papers looking, obviously, at the role of deteriorating relations. So Philippe and co-authors have a great paper. There's this Flynn paper. And so, you know, just curious if we think about that in relation to your effects that you're finding. And so Flynn et al., which is a very, you know, very recent paper, hot off the presses, they find no decrease in US-based citations of Chinese research, but a decline in China-based citations of U.S. research after 2016. And I noticed, I didn't think I saw in the paper, I noticed you had a little button to kind of the, you know, what is Chinese science building on U.S. science. And so here there's a, you know, again, they're using kind of a shock, and this is, that's from their paper where they do an event study. This is event study for Chinese researchers building on U.S. science, and they see a drop in citations. So, you know, kind of how do we put these things together? I know you showed the yearly coefficients, and so, you know, there's definitely like, you know, it could be different samples, different things going on, different control groups, but it would be interesting to kind of see what's driving that. Okay, and then just my last one, and then I'll finish. So yeah, so just thinking, I guess, about, you know, building off of that again, like sample differences, and then, you know, going back to the field question. So I guess with sample, cited papers include non-Chinese co-authors, but U.S. citing papers include papers with all U.S. co-authors. And so, sorry, yes, cited papers. So I guess the question I had here is that we know that international collaboration is increasing. A lot of U.S. researchers also collaborate with Chinese, as, you know, they look at in the paper. But I just wonder how selected that set of papers is that have all U.S. Team members. If I think it's not, you know, it's still the majority, but, you know, how do we think about that research compared to kind of, you know, overall? Maybe just to show the type of selection I think would be useful. And then, yeah, you know, I have a paper also looking just at chemistry, so I would hate the comment, can't you expand, right? And so, you know, I love it that they look at one field, really understand, and, you know, I think they, you know, kind of explain very well why, you know, as Pierre showed with the history, why, you know, why they're choosing it, because they're really at the frontier. But then I wondered, what does that also mean about U.S. papers then? So that means the U.S. is maybe not as good, and so how should we think about that, you know, that's relatively lower quality than other fields? And then also, yeah, I think in Philippe in their paper too, they show, you know, differences in field and the share of frontier research done by Chinese, and so there's some other areas where you have, you know, a large share, so it would be really cool if you could expand. So thank you very much.
Thank you.